Just a quick word of warning. This podcast tells honest and raw stories from the Australian bushfires that may be triggering for some people. Please take care when listening to this podcast and stop if it makes you feel anxious or uncomfortable in any way. We recommend wearing headphones, especially if there are kids around.
Always was, always will be. Aboriginal man. Always was, always will be. Aboriginal man. Has got to go. Hey, hey. Ho, ho. ScoMo has got to go. Hey, hey.
Catastrophic. Tales from the Aussie bushfires.
I'm Sulari Gentill. I'm a writer and I live in Batlow. My husband and my son are both members of the RFS in the Batlow Brigade. So I first became aware of the bushfire as it hit us. I was aware of what was happening around the state, the fires on the coast, Cobargo, etc. But the bushfire that was most relevant to Batlow, which was the Duns Road fire, I first became aware of it when Michael was called out to Ellerslie, which is about 100 kilometres from where we live, to fight a fire that had taken off. And because he was there, I was watching the RFS site, and I saw it when it was a 2-hectare fire, and then all of a sudden it was a 10-hectare fire, and then it was 100 hectares, and then it was 200, and then all of a sudden it was 2,000 hectares. And so we had been watching it grow. And I wasn't particularly concerned beyond general concern for my area and for the people who I knew lived near Ellerslie. I had friends who had houses on that road, and I messaged them to check, well, just to let them know that I was thinking of them. I assumed that they'd be too busy to reply. Michael came home from that fire, and he said to me, "Sulari, if if it gets away into the forest, into the state forest, it's coming straight for us." And it was at that point that we started to get a little bit concerned, or I started to get a little bit concerned and watch it more closely. What happened was, in the space of one night, that fire did get into the forest, and it travelled 100 kilometres towards us. Now, where we live is on the old Tumbarumba Road, which is a road that sort of runs up above Batlow. It's a road on which all the orchards lie, and it backs onto the state forest. And so when Michael came home, I think it was the night before New Year's Eve, so it would have been the 30th. And my eldest son, Edmund, who is 18, is also a member of the RFS. We knew that he would be called out to fight in the next morning, so we made him go to sleep. So he went to sleep in his uniform so that he would be ready to go to do a shift the next day on the Ellerslie fire. And Michael and I stayed up all night in our backyard watching for embers because we expected the fire to start to hit that night. So we had brought up all the pumps, the spare water. We had our hoses ready, and they were just garden hoses, but we had them ready. And I was slightly alarmed, but not panicked, because Michael's been a member of the RFS for a long time, and he said, "Look, we'll just keep back the embers, and we should be able to protect the house." Of course, at that time, we had no concept of what a monster this fire would be. At some time during the night, and we were sitting out in the backyard, and we live on a little bit of a property. So, when you sit in your backyard, it's actually, you're looking out on many, many hectares, and there is eucalypt forest directly behind us, and beyond that there's state pine forest. And we could see the glow through the trees as we were sitting there that night. And at some point, I started to get a little bit panicked. And I thought, I have to get my dogs out of here, because if we have to run at the last minute, we can't pile all the dogs into the car and gather them out if we're going. So I rang a friend of mine in Batlow, in town, because I thought, well, town will be safe. And I asked her if I could drop my dogs off at her house, and she said, sure. And so at some time around midnight, I put all the dogs in the car, and there's 4 of them, and I drove them down to Batlow to leave them in a house in town. And as I was driving back out of Batlow towards my road, I could see the cloud. I could see the fire turning into a massive cloud with lightning at the top of it. And it felt almost like you were driving towards an atomic explosion. And it was at that point that I thought, whoa, we are really in trouble here. But I went back because Michael and Edmund were both in the house. And Michael and I sat out all night and nothing happened. The embers didn't come our way. Edmund got up at 5 or 4 in the morning and he headed in to do his shift. And we made it through the night, and the fire had diverted, and it had missed us by about 3 kilometres at that time, and it had headed into the road between Batlow and Tumbarumba, which got hit very badly with Kunama. And during the night, I'm getting messages from people in Tumbarumba and friends that I know who have houses in Kunama, and we're talking about, who's still standing, etc. But it missed us that first night. And we got up in the morning and we thought, right, we've made it through the night, and daybreak always makes things feel better. So we thought we've survived it. It's fine. We had one hairy night, but it's okay. We're fine. But we spent the rest of the day. So Michael knew that he was going to go on shift the next day or that afternoon. So we spent the day, cleaning up around the yard, making sure there wasn't any debris as much as we possibly could. And it was a really hot day and it was really windy, but we felt like we had survived by then. In the afternoon, at some time in the afternoon, and of course, because I thought we were safe, we did nothing in terms of packing anything up or preparing to leave, because we didn't think we'd have to. I went and got my dogs back from Batlow, and we just did the responsible thing of tidying up around the place, and hosing down the roof and filling gutters. At about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, a neighbour came across and he said, "What are you two still doing here?" And we said, "Well, the danger's past, it's okay." And he informed us that no, the fire was coming towards us in 2 different directions now, and the flank was coming from behind, and the main fire was coming from the south. And he said, "You go now, or you won't get out." And we we did what people normally do, because you feel safest in your home. We thought, "Oh, he's being hysterical." And we continued to tidy up around the place, and we sort of, paid attention to him, because we didn't want him to think we were dismissing him, but we were kind of dismissing him. And then the police arrived at the house, and they virtually said to us, "Are you going or are you staying?" And Michael was saying, "Oh, well, we thought we'd stay. We've got, this much water, and we're on tank water. We don't have a dam, and we're not in town water. We have this much water in the tanks, and we're prepared to fight." And the policeman looked at the big trees around our house, and he didn't say anything about the trees, but he said to us, "You do realise that because of where you are, you will get no help. If things go up, you're on your own." And it was at that point that I started to panic, because I thought, well, if we're on our own, if we can't call anyone for help when we get into trouble, that's it. And we do have, we live in a old rambling weatherboard house. It's surrounded by big trees and creepers and garden. We had in Batlow, we hadn't felt the drought the way the rest of the state had until the last week before the fires, when all those hot, drying winds came through and it killed off our grass and everything was starting to feel dry. So I started to think, hold on, this is not good. And Michael also then started to think, well, okay, well, maybe we should play it safe and leave. And I was also aware that at the time I have a 14-year-old who was away in Melbourne visiting a friend. And it's one thing, I think, when you're young to say I'll stay and fight and I'll risk my life. But I was thinking we'll leave him an orphan. If something happens, he's on his own and I can't do that. So it was a really, really hard decision to abandon your house. And to abandon your property, and the worst part of it is I had to abandon my horses. I have two little ponies that have lived on the property, and they, there's Matilda came to us when Edmund was 5 years old. 3 years old actually. He learned to ride on her, and of course she's a little pony, so in a couple of years he outgrew her, and she's just been a pet since. And then there's a little Brumby that came along to live with us to keep Matilda company. And they mainly just mow the lawn and hang around and are our friends. But I had no way of getting them out. So we spent another hour putting them into the largest paddock we could, and making sure they had water and opening all the gates so that they had places to run to. And then we grabbed the camper trailers because we didn't know where we were going. We thought, well, with the camper trailer, we have a bed or a mattress in there at least. And I went into the wardrobe. And the funny thing is that when you're at that last moment of panic of you've got 5 minutes to find what clothes to take with you, you take the most absurd things in the world. You grab evening gowns because you're panicked. And I had one pair of boots and 2 dresses, no jeans. And Michael took ties. He took a suit and a tie, and we threw them into the bag. We put the 4 dogs in, and we drove. And we took the 2 cars because we had 4 dogs. So I took 2, Michael took 2, and he dragged the camper trailer, and we started driving. And we went out the back way towards Tumut, and then we got into Tumut. Michael pulled over, and he said to me, "Where are we going to go?" And it was at that moment, and it was at that moment that the whole network of Australians started. And a friend and I had posted on Facebook, "We're abandoning the house, we're going now." And all of a sudden we were just inundated with offers from people, and some people I'd never met before in my life, saying, come and stay. We have a spare room. You can stay here. You can bring your dogs. And in the end, a friend from Tumut put me in touch with her father, who gave us a house in Tumut to live in. Now, Tumut's only about half an hour from Batlow, and I didn't want to go too far, so that was perfect for us. And we sort of stopped at that house, thinking this will be over in a day. We only need it for 2 days, and then we'll go back home. The danger will be over one way or another. And at that time, I was aware that the house could go, but I didn't really want to believe it. The fire hadn't really hit us yet, or we knew that Old Tumbarumba Road was in serious danger, and that just up the way in Kanama, houses were ablaze. And I had a call from Edmund. We had a call from Edmund sometime during that day as well, and he was fighting the fires at Kanama, and he called us to say, get out. So it was that heightened sense of danger, but not really coming to terms with the idea that everything was going to go. And I'm very good at not thinking about things I don't want to think about. So I turned my mind off, because at the front of everything, aside from the house, was my horses, ponies. And that was, that was what I was thinking about the whole time. What happened after that was Michael sort of suited up and went out with the RFS again, and I was in that house by myself, just following everything I could on the RFS sites, the ABC, which was giving you up-to-date information on what was happening, messaging people in and out of Batlow. We were one of the first people to leave Batlow. That was New Year's Eve, because of where we were on the old Tumbarumba Road. In the following days, I think New Year's Day or the day after, the RFS and the emergency services held a big meeting with the town, and Batlow was told that it was undefendable, that the fire was heading straight, not just for Old Tumbarumba Road, but for the town, and it was undefendable. There was nothing they could do. We would burn. And so what happened at that point was that people started piling out of Batlow. Eventually, the little house that I was living in Tumut had 3 refugee families from Batlow, because we all just piled in. All of us had family members in the RFS, and we didn't want to go too far. But Tumut was also under a bit of danger as well, but it was safer. And Tumut has a river running through it, so we always thought, well, if worse comes to worse, we can go to the river in Tumut and sit in the river. But our big concern was Batlow, and we knew that the big horrible day would be Friday night, Saturday, when the fire was going to hit. And it just got hotter and hotter and hotter. And that day that it hit, and it was interesting in that we had there was a long time there when we didn't know whether our houses were standing. So we knew the fire was raging in Batlow, but you couldn't get in or out. There was one time when things sort of cooled off a bit and you could get into Batlow, and they were letting people in to go look at livestock and check on livestock. And I drove up by myself. Michael and Edmund were both fighting the fires on Duns Road, the Duns Road fire on the road between Batlow and Tumbarumba. And so I jumped in my car and I thought, I'm going up, I'm going to check on the horses. I went to Coles and bought a huge bag of carrots, and I headed up. And it was eerie. It's, the thing that's amazing about Batlow is that it is a place that's teeming with wildlife, and we get used to it. We almost take it for granted. So here, under normal circumstances, there's always bird song, and often in the mornings it's what wakes you up because the birds are so darn loud. And that summer we'd had a lot of cicadas, so there was this background scream of cicadas. But as I came up, it was quiet. There was nothing, and it was smoky. It was just so thick with smoke. And I got to the house, and I thought I might grab some things while I'm here, because it had started to dawn on me that this was really, really serious. And I kind of was happy to be there by myself because I wanted the chance to say goodbye. And so I walked around the house and I grabbed paintings off the wall. And you feel like a thief in your own house. It's a really bizarre thing to take paintings off the wall in your own house because you're trying to save the paintings. You feel like you're robbing your own house. And I got to the point where I grabbed some paintings off the wall And the smoke was so thick that I'd be in the house, I'd grab a few things, and then I'd take a deep breath and I'd run outside to put them in the car because the air outside was so thick with smoke you couldn't breathe. And I did this once or twice. And then and I'm a writer, so I stood in front of the bookshelf where all my books were from when I started being published. And all the books from other writers with first edition signed. And I thought, what will I take? And I thought, how do I choose? And so in the end, I took nothing. I thought, well, I'll leave it with the house. And if it goes, everything goes. And so I had my few paintings, and then I got a call from Michael, and he was working on containment lights just behind our house, a kilometre or two away, and it was broken up signal. And he said to me, he knew I was there, and he said, Sulari, we've lost control of the fire, get out. And so I got in the car and I headed out. I stopped at the paddock. I threw all the carrots in. I couldn't see my horses. They were nowhere in sight. So I just threw the carrots next to the trough, and I headed back down to Tumut. And I thought, by the time I got home, I thought, all right, well, the house is gone. But and then you know the build up happened to that terrible Saturday, and I had learned by then that no, my house was still standing. So even though the fire had got away, the house was still standing. So I'd missed my house, and then we had that horrible day, and I was by that time I was starting to not care about the house because Michael and Edmund and the rest of the RFS was in there. And I was thinking, if Batlow is undefendable, why are we even leaving the RFS in there? Why aren't we pulling them out and saving them? You know, let the town burn. It's not worth a life. But the RFS stayed and they defended. And then about 2:00 in the afternoon, Michael rang me and he said, everybody's been pulled out of Old Tumbarumba Road because the fire's hit it. Our house will be gone in 20 minutes. And so, you know, that was the moment when I thought, well, it's gone. It's just, you know, the house is gone. But it was also the thought that not only the house, the town was going to go. And so, you know, it's one thing to think you'll lose your house, but all your networks of support and familiarity are in your town that you live in. And when you think that that's all going to go and everything is going to be gone, it suddenly makes you feel incredibly unanchored. And it's also a strange thing to, you know, that day when I was leaving the house. It's a very strange thing to be fleeing your own house, because I think, you know, in this crazy world that we live in, and we all work and we all go out and we all meet people, home is always refuge. It's always where you relax, where you feel safe. And suddenly when your house and your home is no longer safe, it's a very, very strange feeling. So at that time I thought, well, my house is gone. The people I was sharing a house with also had houses in Batlow, but they were in Batlow. So there was a chance that their houses would survive. And they also were in better positions than us. We were in the most drastic position. So there were people with bulldozers putting containment lights and things around their house. And that night, I remember we all sat there. It was 40-something degrees, absolutely horrendously hot. We had tried to secure the house we were staying in Tumut as much as possible. We swept up all the leaves and got rid of all the rubbish, and we hosed down the house because the winds were coming. And we had a plan, and we all moved into the garage, which was right at the bottom of the house and built into the hill, because we thought, well, if the fire comes, it's likely to go over the top of this, and then we'll at least have a chance. And at that time, they had evacuated Tumut as well. So it was quite eerie that day because there was no one there. And we had got onto the comms between the RFS comms, the fire comms, so that we could listen to what was happening with the trucks to that night. And I remember we heard the Batlow captain say that the fire had gone nimbo-cumulus, and it had hit. And I remember, and you recognise the voices because they're men you've known, and they're steady men, and they're men who've dealt with fires before. And when you hear panic in their voices, it's terrifying. And you hear the exchanges of what's going on in the trucks. You hear men begging for help, begging for aerial help, and the person who was managing the comms having to tell them there's no help coming. It's too smoky. They can't send any water bombers up. There's nothing coming. And that was it was just the most amazing, traumatic thing to have to listen to this, knowing that you have family in there. And I was thinking the whole time, this is crazy. Why aren't they just evacuating the RFS and just letting it go? But the RFS stayed, and they fought. And I heard a lot of the stories from Michael and Edmund afterwards about what they did in particular. And there's that night, my 18-year-old, his position on the Cat 1, which is the big fire truck, is he's the guy that stands at the top of the truck with the hose. And so he spent 23 hours on the top of that truck with a high-pressure hose in a row. Michael had smaller hose at a different area of the truck, and he was telling me there was one point they were going down one road, and it was just red. It was that footage that has become famous now of a fire truck going through fire. He said there was fire going over the road on both sides of them, and it was absolutely hot in the truck. But Edmund went up because he's 18 and 10 foot tall and bulletproof, and he took the big hose to try and douse the flames around as the truck was driving, which was incredibly dangerous. And Michael was saying he didn't want him to go, but Edmund insisted. And then Michael was saying that he thought it was too dangerous, but the thought of Edmund being there alone was something he couldn't live with. So he went up as well and took the small hose. And he thought, well, at least, we'll die together. But they managed to hold it back. The truck melted. Edmund's helmet melted in the heat, but they managed to save, I think, 80% of the houses in Batlow. And all the time that was happening, they were aware that our house was gone, or they thought that our house was gone, was burning. And that's, that I didn't sleep that night. And because I was up listening to the comms, watching the fire, listening to any sound that there had been casualties in Batlow, any news of that sort, watching Facebook in case anyone posted anything that I wasn't aware of. And it was just this feverish night of being glued to your devices, trying to get whatever information you could, whilst it is, 43 degrees in the house, and there's 10 people all hovered around there. And then about 2:00 in the morning, my neighbour, who had stayed to fight, and they had stayed to fight because they're incredibly prepared. They have a different sort of property to ours. Their house is in sort of the middle of cleared paddocks, and they have big bulldozers. So they had bulldozed around their house several times and created a fire break. And of course, they didn't have the big trees that we have, and they don't actually back onto eucalypt forest. But I got a message from Karen, and it was just on Facebook, and it said, Sulari, Ryan, we thought we saw your house burn, but Ryan's just been up there and your house is still standing. And it was this feeling of, how does this happen? And I wasn't, I believed it, but I knew it wasn't over. And so I believed it with hesitation of, okay. When she sent this message, the house was still standing. But it turned out it was. And Karen tells me afterwards, or now, that after she'd sent that message to me, she couldn't sleep because she thought, what if the house burns now? And I've told Sulari it's standing. But as it was, it did. It survived it. Everything else was burnt. So all the outbuildings, my garden, some of the really grand old trees. We were protected, I think, because of those trees that we thought would kill us. The house is surrounded by oaks, and they caught the flames and they held them. And when you see our garage, which is just ash, and it is 2 meters from the house, and the house is standing. All the tanks have melted. It was, everything was, metal is just charred. I have these wonderful shards of glass which have been kilned into these amazing shapes because it was so hot. And yet, for some reason, the house did not go up. And we've had neighbours say to us, next time we build a house, we're going to let you pick the spot because obviously you're good at picking miracles because the house shouldn't be. The boys' cubby was ash, and we built that when Edmund was 2 with him. It was an old garden shed that we moved and we turned it. And of course, Edmund was an only child and our first child then, so we were ridiculous, as most parents are with their first children, and we had built him this amazing hubby that both the boys had adored. And, I went all Michelangelo and painted murals on the ceiling, all of that insane thing that you do. And that burnt to the ground. There was nothing left of it. The garden and the trees, all the roses went up, but the house was still there. So a couple of days afterwards, the day afterwards, Michael and Edmund went back to see what was left, fully expecting to see nothing but rubble, and they found our house standing, and they found my horses. That was the main thing. There's a lot of my messaging has been, has anyone seen my horses? Can anyone check on my horses? And they were there. And luckily we had been hit by 2 fires. And the first fire was a slow burning trickle fire. And it had burnt part of the paddock. So it meant that when the second fire came through, they could go into the burnt parts and wait it out. So that was amazing. And an amazing reunion. But in a funny way, having those moments of thinking, of really believing that the house was gone, that the horses were gone, and the horses more than anything else, I thought they were relying on me to save them, and I couldn't. And having that night of thinking my husband or my son could be gone makes me very, very, not blasé, but very relaxed about what has happened. So in the end, when we came back to the house, everything but the house is gone. The horses survived, but the paddocks are gone. The truffery is burnt. It may survive, but it's been impacted quite heavily. The fences are gone. I've got no front fence. It feels kind of exposed here. but and it's charred. Everything's sooty. But I'm really aware of how much worse it could have been, and so in the end, we're just happy, to be honest. We're happy that by some stroke of luck, it wasn't a whole stack worse. I think that we need to really get serious. If we are putting people in this kind of danger, we need to say, well, forget the cost. We're going to do whatever it takes to make them as safe as we humanly can. What struck me is that the RFS doesn't have breathing gear. I know that Edmund and Michael were fighting in this absolutely choking smoke. These houses that were ablaze, that were filled with asbestos, and they had the little white masks that you get from the chemist, and that was it. But aside from that, there's been so much about what the government did and didn't do, and certainly I'm as angry as anybody that this was allowed to happen. This is not a normal cycle. It is not an unforeseeable thing. It was foreseen.
The bigger question is when we as a country are going to stop putting our heads in the sand and acknowledge that we do have a climate emergency, a disaster unfolding, and that we are in the middle of it and we are responsible for it, and only we can actually turn it back. Now, I can understand the allure of pretending that we can do nothing about it, the allure of pretending it's just a natural cycle and everything will go back to normal eventually. It's a little bit like when I was not wanting to think that my house had burnt to the ground, not wanting to think about it because it was just too much and it was too awful to contemplate. But the reality is that grown-ups can't do that. We can't go on pretending forever, and now is the time to get serious, to get real about what is happening and to do something about it. But more than just our leadership, and I will acknowledge that I think our leadership failed us here. I think the reason that we were on fire is our leadership refused to acknowledge what was happening, refused to look at advice, refused to listen to people who were saying this is what is going to happen. And to the extent that our Prime Minister refused to have meetings with fire chiefs who had been trying to warn him exactly of this for a year beforehand, when things might have been done to protect towns like Batlow. But aside from that, I think what I would like to say is not so much to our leadership, but to the Australian people. Our leadership is there because we vote them in. We need to start making environment a priority in the way we think, in the way we act, and most importantly, in the way we vote. It will never be a priority for our leaders unless their jobs depend on it. And we have got to start thinking that what someone says they are willing to do for our environment and how important that is to their agenda is going to outweigh things like franking credits. We will not be distracted and dissuaded from the most important challenge that's facing this generation and the world today by being seduced into worrying about issues which in the face of having everything burn around you mean nothing.
You're listening to Catastrophic, a dual podcast and political protest project. Catastrophic tells the tales of the Australian bushfires and calls for all-partisan political action around climate change. Each episode of Catastrophic features an Australian talking about their experience of living through the bushfire crisis, what their fears are now and for the future, and what they would like to see done about it on a government level. But it doesn't end when the episode of Catastrophic goes out. We at Listen Up Podcasting are taking every story we gather, every episode we release of the Catastrophic podcast, and sending it to all the politicians every single week. We will also be alerting the media organisations every single time a file goes out. That way, the pollies can't pretend these stories don't matter and that these demands for change don't exist. So what are the demands? What are we demanding on the Catastrophic podcast from the government? Pretty simple, really. 1. No new coal, oil and gas projects, including the Adani mine and the Wallara 2 coal project. 2. 100% renewable energy generation and exports by 2030. 3. Fund a just transition and job creation for all fossil fuel workers and communities. 4. Hand over land conservation management to First Nations Australians. 5. Start preserving our water and treating it as a precious resource, not a sellable commodity. If you or anyone you know has a story they would like to share from or about the Aussie bushfires, please instant message us via the Catastrophic Podcast Facebook page or email us at info@listenuppodcasting.com.au and we will get in touch with you and record your story. It may not be straight away. We are fielding a lot of stories at the moment, but every single one is important and we will get to all of them. Thank you for listening to and participating in the Catastrophic Podcast project. Our bushfire season hasn't ended yet. So my big message to you is please be safe, look after each other, care for this planet, and do not stop fighting for action around climate change. This podcast was produced and edited by Kel Butler from Listen Up Podcasting. Podcasts for a positive world.
Always was, always will be. Aboriginal man.
The Climactic Collective.